Chapter 2, Gilded by Marissa Meyer. Cyrilda drew her cloak tight as she left the schoolhouse. There was still an hour of daylight, plenty of time to get home to the mill, but this winter had been colder than any she could remember, with snow nearly to her knees and dangerous patches of ices where the wagon wheels had cut slushy grooves along the roads. The wetness was sure to have soaked through her boots and into her stockings long before she got home, and she was dreading the misery of it just as much as she was looking forward to the fire her father would have started in the hearth, and a bowl of steaming broth she would drink while she warmed her toes. These midwinter walks home from the school were the only time Cyrilda wished they didn't live quite so far outside of town. Bracing herself against the cold, she pulled up the hood and surged forward. Head lowered, arms crossed, pace as quick as she would allow while trying not to slip on the treacherous ice lurking under the most recent layer of feather-soft snow. The crisp air mingled with the smell of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. At least they weren't meant to have more snow tonight. The sky was clear and threatening gray clouds. The snow moon would be on full display, and though it wasn't as notable as when the full moon crossed with the solstice, she felt there must be some enchantment tethered to a full moon on the first night of a new year. The world was full of small enchantments when one was willing to look for them, and Cyrilda was always looking. The hunt will be celebrating the change of the calendar, as are we all, she whispered, distracting herself as her teeth began to chatter. After their demonic ride, there will be a feasting on what beasts they've captured, and drinking of mulled wine spiced with blood. Something hard hit Cyrilda on the back, right between her shoulder blades. She yelped and spun around, her foot slipping. She tumbled backward, her rump landing in a cushion of snow. "I got her!" came Anna's delightful cry. It was met with eruptions of cheers and laughter as the children emerged from their hiding places. 5 small figures padded in layers of wool and fur. They popped out from behind tree trunks and wagon wheels and an overgrown shrub weighed down with icicles. "What took you so long?" said Fritz, a snowball ready in his mittened hand, while at his side Anna was busily starting to scrape together another one. "We've been waiting to ambush you near an hour," Nichols started complaining of frostbite. "It's unmerciful cold out here," said Nickel, Fritz's twin, hopping from foot to foot. "Oh, shut your whistler. Even the baby's not complaining, you old cogwheel." Gertrude, the youngest, at 5 years old, turned to Fritz with an annoyed scowl. "I'm not a baby," she shouted, hurling a snowball at him, and though her aim was good, it still landed with a soft kerfluff at his feet. I was just making a point," said Fritz, which was as close as he ever got to an apology. I know you're about to be a big sister and all." This easily assuaged Gertrude's anger, and she stuck up her nose with a proud huff. It wasn't just being the youngest that made the others think of her as the baby of the group. She was particularly small for her age and particularly precious, with a sprinkling of freckles across her round cheeks and strawberry ringlets that never seemed to tangle, no matter how much she tried to keep up with Anna's acrobats. "The point is," snapped Hans, "we're all shivering. There's no need to act the dying swan." At 11, Hans was the oldest of their group. As such, he liked to overplay his role of the leader and protector around the schoolhouse, a role the others had seemed content to let him claim. "Speak for yourself," said Anna, winding her arm before throwing her new snowball at the abandoned wagon wheel off to the side of the road. It hit the center dead on. "I'm not cold." "Only because you've been doing cartwheels for the past hour," muttered Nickel. Anna grinned, her smile gapped with a number of missing teeth, and launched herself into a somersault. Gertrude squilled delightfully. Somersaults were so far the only trick she'd mastered, and hurried to join her, both of them leaving trails in the snow. "And just why were you all waiting to ambush me?" asked Cyrilda. "Don't any of you have nice warm fires waiting for you at home?" Gertrude stopped, legs splayed in front of her, and snow clinging to her hair. "We were waiting for you to finish the story." She liked the scary stories more than any of them, though she couldn't listen without burying her nose in Hans's shoulder. About the wild hunt and the god of lies and... Nope, Cerilda shook her head. Nope, nope, nope. I've been scolded by Madame Sawyer for the last time. I'm done telling tales. Starting today, you'll get nothing but boring news and most trivial of facts. For example, did you know that playing 3 particular notes on the hackbret will summon a demon? You are definitely making that up, said Nickel. Am not, it's true, ask anyone. Oh, also, the only way to kill off a noxious is by putting a stone into its mouth. That will keep it from gnawing on its own flesh while you cut off the head. Now, that's the sort of education that might come in handy someday, said Fritz with an impish grin. Though he and his brother were identical on the outside, same blue eyes and fluffy blonde hair and dimpled chins, it was never difficult to tell them apart. Fritz was always the one looking for trouble, and Nickel was always the one looking embarrassed that they were related. Cerilda gave a sage nod. My job is to prepare you for adulthood. Ugh, said Hans. You're playing at teacher, aren't you? I am your teacher. No, you're not. You're barely Madame Sawyer's assistant. She only lets you around because she can't get the littles to quiet down, because you can get the littles to quiet down when she can't. You mean us? Asked Nickel, gesturing around to himself and the others. Are we the littles? Well, almost as old as you. We're almost as old as you, added Fritz. Hans snorted. You're 9. That's 2 whole years. It's an eternity. It's not 2 years, says Nickel, starting to count off on his thumb. Our birthday is in August and yours is... All right, interrupted Cerilda, who had heard this argument too many times. You're all littles to me, and it's time for me to start taking your education more seriously, to stop filling your heads with nonsense. I'm afraid that story time has ended. This proclamation was met with a chorus of melodramatic groans, whining, and pleas. Fritz even fell face first into the snow and kicked his feet in a tantrum that may or may not have been a mimicry of one of Gertrude's bad days. I mean it this time, she said, scowling. Sure you do, said Anna with a robust laugh. She had stopped doing flips and was now testing the strength of a young linden tree by hanging from one of the lower branches, her legs kicking back and forth, just like last time and the time before that. But now I'm serious. They stared at her, unconvinced, which she supposed was fair. How many times had she told them that she was done telling stories? She was going to become a model teacher, a fine, honest lady once and for all. It never lasted. Just one more lie, as Madame Sawyer had said. But Cerilda, said Fritz, shuffling toward her on his knees and peering up at her with wide, charmed eyes, winter in Marchenfield is so awfully boring. Without your stories, what will we have to look forward to? A life of hard labor, muttered Hans, mending fences and plowing fields and spinning, said Anna with a distraught sigh before she curled her legs up and draped her knees over the branch, letting her hands and braids dangle. The tree groaned threateningly, but she ignored it. So much spinning. Of all the children, Cerilda thought that Anna looked the most like her, especially since Anna had started wearing her long brown hair in twin braids, as Cerilda had worn hers for most of her life. But Anna's tan skin was a few shades darker than Cerilda's, and her hair wasn't quite as long yet. Plus, there were all those missing milk teeth, only some of which had fallen out naturally. They also shared a mutual hatred for the laborious work of spinning wool. At 8 years old, Anna had recently been taught the fine art of her family's will. Cerilda had looked upon her with an appropriate sympathy, which, when she heard the news, referring to the work as tedium incarnate. The description had been repeated among the children all the following week, amusing Cerilda and infuriating the witch, who had spent an entire hour lecturing on the importance of honest work. Please, Cerilda, continued Gertrude, your stories, I think they're sort of like spinning too, because it's like you're making something beautiful out of nothing. Why, Gertrude, what an astute metaphor, said Cerilda, impressed that Gertrude had thought of such a comparison. But That was one thing she loved about children. They were always surprising her. And you're right, Gertie, said Hans. Cyrilda's stories take our dull existence and transform it into something special. It's like spinning straw into gold. Oh, now you're just smearing honey on my mouth, Cyrilda scoffed, even as she cast her eyes toward the sky, quickly darkening overhead. Would that I could spin straw into gold? It'd be far more useful than this, spinning nothing but silly stories. Rotting your minds, as Madame Sawyer would say. Curse Madame Sawyer, said Fritz. His brother shot him a warning look for the harsh language. Fritz, mind your tongue, said Cyrilda, feeling like a little chastisement was warranted, even if she appreciated his coming to her defense. I mean it. There's no harm in a few stories. She's just jealous because the only stories she can tell us are about old dead kings and their grubby descendants. She wouldn't know a good tale if it rose up and bit her. The children laughed until the branch that Anna was hanging from gave a sudden crack and she fell into the heap of snow. Cyrilda gasped and rushed towards her. Anna! Still alive, said Anna. It was her favorite phrase, and one she had cause to use frequently. Untangling herself from the branch, she sat up and beamed at them all. Good thing Solvid put all this snow here to break my fall. With a giggle, she gave her head a shake, sending a tiny flurry of snowflakes cascading onto her shoulders. When she was done, she blinked up at Cyrilda. So, you're going to finish that story, aren't you? Cyrilda tried to frown disapprovingly. She knew she wasn't doing a very good job at being the mature adult among them. You're relentless, and I must admit, quite persuasive. She heaved a drawn-out sigh. Fine, a quick story, because the hunt will be riding tonight, and we all should be getting home. Come here. She forged a path through the snow to a small copse of trees where there was a bed of dry pine needles and drooping branches offered some protection from the chill. The children eagerly gathered around her, claiming spots amid the roots, shoulder to shoulder for what warmth they could share. Tell us more about the god of lies, said Gertrude, sliding beside Hans in case she got scared. Cyrilda shook her head. I have another story I want to tell you now. The sort of story that belongs under a full moon. She gestured toward the horizon, where the new risen moon was stained the color of summer straw. This is a different story about the wild hunt, which only rides beneath a full moon, storming over the landscape with their night horses and hellhounds. Today, the hunt has but one leader at their helm, the wicked Earl King. But hundreds of years ago, the hunt was led not by the Earl King, but by his paramour, Perchta, the great huntress. She was met with eager curiosity, the children leaning closer with bright eyes and growing smiles. Despite the cold, Cyrilda flushed with her own excitement. There was a shiver of anticipation, for even she rarely knew what twists and turns her stories would take before the words slipped from her tongue. Half the time, she was surprised by the revelations as her listeners. It was part of what drew her to storytelling, not knowing the end, not knowing what would happen next. She was on the adventure every bit as much as the children were. The two were wildly in love, she continued. Their passion could bring lightning crashing down from the heavens. When the Earl King looked at his fierce mistress, his black heart was so moved that storms would surge over the oceans and earthquakes would tremble the mountaintops. The children made faces. They tended to bemoan any mention of romance, even shy Nickel and dreamy Gertrude, who Cyrilda suspected secretly enjoyed it. But there was one problem with their love. Perchta desperately yearned for children, but the dark ones have more death than life in their blood and thus cannot bring children into the world. Therefore, such a wish was impossible. Or so Perchta thought. Her eyes glinted as the story began to unfold right in front of her. Still, it tore at the Earl King's rotten heart to see his love pining away year after year for a child to call her own. How she wept, her tears becoming torrents of rain that soaked the fields. How she moaned and her cries rolling like thunder over the hills. Unable to stand seeing her thus, the Earl King traveled to the end of the world to plead to Eostreg, the god of fertility, begging them to place a child in Perchta's womb. But Eostreg, who watches over all new life, could tell that Perchta was made of more cruelty than motherly affection, and they dared not subject a child to such a parent. No amount of pleading from the Earl King could sway them. And so the Earl King made his way back through the wilderness, loath to think of how this news would disappoint his love. But as he was riding through the ashen wood, Serilda paused, meeting each of the children's gaze in turn, for those words had sent a new energy thrilling through them. The ashen wood was the setting of so many stories, not just her own. It was the source of more folk tales, more night terrors, more superstitions than she could count, especially here in Markenfield. The ashen wood lay just to the north of their small town. A short ride through the fields, and its haunting presence was felt by all villagers from the time they were toddling babes, raised on warnings of all the creatures that lived in that forest, from those who were silly and mischievous to others foul and cruel. The name cast a new spell over the children. No longer was Serilda's story of Perchta and her Earl King a distant tale. Now it was on their own doorstep. As he traveled through the ashen wood, the Earl King heard a most unpleasant sound. Sniffling, sobbing, wet, blubbery, disgusting noises, most often associated with wet, blubbering, disgusting children. He saw the mongrel then, a pathetic little thing, barely big enough to walk about on its pudgy legs. It was a human baby boy, covered head to foot in scratches and mud, wailing for his mother, which was when the Earl King had the most devious idea. She smiled, and the children smiled back, for they too could see where the story was headed. Or so they thought. And so the Earl King picked up the child by its filthy nightgown and deposited him in one of the large sacks on the side of his horse. And off he went, racing back to Gravenstone Castle, where Perchta waited to greet him. He presented the child to his love, and her joy made the sun itself burn brighter. Months went by, and Perchta doted on that child as only a queen can. She took him on tours of dead swamps that lie deep in the woods. She bathed him in sulphur springs and dressed him in the skins of the finest beasts she had ever hunted. The fur of the Rasselbach and the feathers of the Stoppelhahn. She rocked him in the branches of the willow trees and sang lullabies to him to lull him to sleep. He was even gifted his own hellhound to ride, so that he might join his huntress mother on her monthly outings. She was content then for some years. However, as time passed, the Earl King began to notice a new melancholy overtaking his love. One night he asked her what was the matter, and with a sorrowful cry, Perchta gestured at her baby boy, who was no longer a baby, but had become a wiry, strong-willed child, and said, "I have never wanted anything more than to have a babe of my own. But alas, this creature before me is no baby. He is a child now, and soon he will be a man. I no longer want him." Nickel gasped, horrified to think that a mother, apparently so devoted, could say such a thing. He was a sensitive boy, and perhaps Serilda had not yet told him enough of the old tales which so often began with parents or step-parents finding themselves utterly disenchanted with their offspring. And so the Earl King lured the boy back out into the forest, telling him that they were going to practice his archery and bring home a game bird for a feast. But when they were deep enough into the woods, the Earl King took his long hunting blade from his belt, crept up behind the boy. The children sank away from her aghast. Gertrude buried her face in Hans's arm and slit his throat, leaving him in the cold creek to die. Serilda waited a moment for their shock and disgust to ease before she continued. Then the Earl King went off in search of new prey, not wild beasts this time, but another human child to give to his love. And the Earl King had been taken lost children back to the castle ever since.